In this video, we're going to talk about how to set Chronicle up so that it calculates overtime based on both your state laws and on your company's policies, and also how to set Chronicle up for overrides to pay rates, whether prevailing wage applies or whether you have special pay rates. The labor setup options are on the Labor Setup tab in Chronicle's Labor Manager. You can only access this tab if you meet the security context for Labor Setup. A separate video talks about the security settings that affect labor, and see that video if you need more help on the security part of this. Within the Labor Setup tab, there are 3 sub-tabs: overtime, double time rates, weekend and holiday rates, and labor activities. We'll talk about each of these separately. On the Overtime Double Time Rates tab, settings determine when your work week begins and when Chronicle should calculate daily and weekly overtime, change the number of hours as needed for each to correspond to the laws in your region as well as your company's policies. Below those overtime and double time settings are a series of checkboxes that determine in what cases employees are allowed to override standard pay rates. When you are entering labor or reviewing labor on the labor detail page, you can right-click any entry. You can force that labor to overtime or double time. You can indicate that prevailing wage applies to that particular job. You can force it to a special rate. Which of those you are allowed to do is determined by the settings here, so that if you have overtime rate checked, then a user is allowed to force a particular pay entry to the overtime rate. If that's not checked, then overtime will only be calculated based on the daily and weekly hour rules, and the user won't be able to force any change. Likewise, if a user is allowed to force something to double time, you'd want that box checked. If the box is unchecked, that option will not be on the menu. Usually you would not check the box to indicate that pay rates are exempt from overtime. Usually things that are exempt from overtime are dealt with in the labor activities. We will talk about that separately. Occasionally, HR policies allow certain items to be exempt from daily overtime, but not from weekly overtime. If that could apply in your business, then you would want to check that box. In the U.S., there is we believe that it's a federal law that requires that non-discretionary bonuses affect your overtime rates. A separate video talks about that. Our understanding is that all users in the U.S. need to have this box checked. Users outside the U.S. should have that unchecked. If in your region prevailing wage or union rates can override people's regular pay rates, then check the box here. Once again, that's going to control whether or not the prevailing wage option is present on the right-click menu and on the ad screen. When on the labor screen, if you choose to delete a labor entry, whether this confirmation box comes up is determined by whether or not confirmed labor deletions is checked. Finally, at the bottom of the screen, you have the option of adding special pay rates if you have special actions that require that people be paid some rate other than their normal hourly rate. Add as many rates as you need. Anything that you add here will appear on the ad screen and on the right-click menu. Some companies only use the normal daily and weekly overtime rules to determine what people get paid on weekends and holidays. But some companies have special rules where they always pay a higher rate on Saturdays or Sundays or holidays. If that is the case in your business, then indicate what rate to use on each day. If you indicate that something other than standard overtime calculations are used on holidays, then the holiday list to the right is enabled and you can add as many holidays as you wish. When you add a holiday, if the holiday is on the same day every year, for example, Christmas is always December 25th, regardless of the year, indicate that it's the same date every year, and Chronicle will preserve that holiday and use it in future years. If you have a holiday like Thanksgiving that's on a different date every year, check that option and Chronicle will also collect a year. In that case, Chronicle will only apply the holiday rate in the year that you've identified. Each year you would have to come into the holiday list and reset up that holiday for the next year. Finally, the Labor Activities tab lets you indicate whether labor can be entered for each of the activities Some internal administrative activities like making a phone call or submitting paperwork don't need to have labor hours tracked for them, indicate that labor should not be entered for that activity. That will keep that activity out of the labor entry screen. To change that entry, simply double-click. And then if there are any activities in the list, typically these would be administrative or human resource activities. If there are activities that are non-work pay, right-click those activities and indicate, for example, that a particular kind of pay is paid leave or unpaid leave for sick or vacation time. There's a separate video that talks about setting up for the off-duty tracking. See that video for more details. Another part of your labor setup is setting up your employees and their pay rates. That's discussed in a separate video. For help with that or any other labor topics, see our other labor videos.